All right, here we go. Last chapter of Brian's Winter, and then I'll read the epilogue. Here we go. Chapter 17. He had fooled himself before. He had thought he heard planes when none were there. He imagined he saw people, had thought guns were going off when the trees were exploding. All wrong. And so now he thought of what it could be. If it wasn't trees exploding, then what? He could think of nothing but a gun. Unless somehow trees exploded when it got warm as well as when it was cold. He had neglected camp and spent all the next day cleaning the shelter, bringing in more wood, retightening the snowshoes, checking the bowstring, and sharpening the hatchet and knife. It was still warm, so he put his sleeping bag out to air, and somehow when he had done these things, it was near dark and time to cook again and settle in for the night. But he was not tired, and all the day while he worked around camp, and then at dark when he made the fire and started to cook, all that time he kept listening for the sound again, knowing that it was warm and that it might not be trees, but not thinking past that, just listening, waiting. But he did not hear it again. He lay awake looking at the coals, the warm glow lighting his face, and when his eyes closed, he knew that the next day he would go and try to find the place where he had heard the popping sounds. He thought it must be a good distance. The sounds were faint, and he would probably find some plausible reason for the sound. But he would look. He had to look. He awakened before dawn, made a small fire to cook stew, and then prepared his gear. He had not forgotten the wolves, and he saw to his lance and warbow and arrows hung, the hatchet and the knife on a thong around his shoulder, and left camp just after good light. Brian knew it might be a wasted trip, and he decided to swing past the wolf-killed moose. There had been 4 wolves, but it was a large moose, and there would probably be meat left over if the wolves were gone. He needn't have worried. The wolves had eaten off the rear end and the middle and were gone, but the back and front shoulders were intact, and Brian made a mental note to swing around and start carrying meat back to the camp when he finished the search. The warm weather had softened the snow surface, and then it had refrozen during the night, so the snowshoes didn't sink in at all, but rode along the top, and Brian found it was almost like skating. If I had skis, he murmured, I could fly. And he wondered how hard it would be to make a pair of skis, whittle them out of wood. Almost impossible. But his mind stayed on it, thinking on how he would cut a straight log and split it with the hatchet and carved it flat and somehow warp the end, seeing it in his mind, visualizing each step. And he was so caught up in the idea of the skis that he almost missed it. A line. He had come 3 miles and a bit more, working along the tops of the ridges where he could see farther. There were hundreds of ponds and lakes scattered through the woods, and he wove between them, staying high. He saw 3 moose, more than a dozen deer, and hundreds of rabbits, and could have had many shots, but was trying to find some sign, something that would be out of the ordinary. And there it was. A line in the middle of a lake, more than a mile away, and below the ridge he was walking on, out across the ice from the east to the west side of the lake. There was a line, a straight line. He saw it and didn't see it, looked away and kept walking, thinking of the skis, and then stopped. Did a long double take and looked again, and there it was, a straight line in the snow across the lake. Brian had discovered that there are almost no straight lines in nature. The sides of trees up and down, the horizon far away, but very little else. Animal tracks almost always wandered, circled. Seldom did they go straight for any distance. But the lake was a mile away. The line could be anything. He walked closer, watching it as he came off the ridge, until the trees blotted it out, and then picking up the pace sliding the snowshoes over the hard surface as fast as he could move until he saw it again. Not on the lake this time, but through the trees ahead before going out onto the ice, the same line. Closer, he could see that it was not just a line, but a depression in the snow that went along straight. And when he moved still closer, he could see that the depression was about 5 inches deep, almost 2 feet wide. And the bottom of it was smooth as packed ice, a flattened trail that went off the bank and out onto the surface of the lake. It was almost definitely not a natural trail. Something had come along here. There were no tracks, just a smooth, flat, wide depression. Brian squatted by the side of it and tried to visualize what had made this path. Something came by here, he thought. And then, no, not something, but somebody came by here. A person. He thought, another person in the world. He'd come to think there were no other people, and here was this strange track. Almost certainly a person made it, but in what manner? Then he saw the edge of a print. On the side of the flattened area, just to the edge, was one clear wolf print. It was as plain as if the wolf had stepped in plaster and made a cast in the soft snow. From the warm weather, there was a wolf print, one heading out on the lake. Somebody with a wolf? No, that didn't work. Somebody walking, pulling something, and then coming on an old wolf trail and covering the tracks, all but one. Pulling what? A toboggan of some kind? Somebody coming along, pulling a toboggan on an old wolf trail out here in the middle of the wilderness. Out here? It was insane. Brian wasn't sure where he was, had no true idea how far the plane had come off course before he crashed. But he was certain nobody could have pulled a toboggan from civilization out here. And for a second he doubted that he was seeing what he was actually seeing. A track left by a person. Perhaps he was hallucinating. But he shook his head, and it was still there, all of it. And if he was dreaming this or hallucinating it, then he would have to have hallucinated all of it. The wolves, the moose, kill, the popping sounds. No, it was real. So what did he do? Follow the tracks, he thought. Don't be stupid. But which way? There was no indication from the flat surface of the track of any direction, just the wolf print heading out onto the lake. Well, why not? That was as good as any, and Brian set off walking on the track itself, which was like a packed highway. If he was not particularly excited, it was because, in truth, some part of him did not believe what he was seeing, what he was doing. He crossed the lake and went into the woods on the other side, and there was no change, just the hard-packed trail out ahead of him. And he kept moving, seeing the wolf prints more often, especially where the trail curved around a tree. The prints would be on the outside, and in this way he passed the day. Toward mid-afternoon, he was hungry and stopped to eat from the meat in his pouch, eating snow to wash it down. And then he set off again, and just before dark, he caught a smell he knew well. Smoke. Just a taint on the faint breeze that had come up. Some of the dry, dead wood and a bit of pine, he thought, sniffing, and then it was gone. And he kept walking, thinking he must be close now. Or the wind had carried it far. And in the evening light, he came around the corner, past a large evergreen, and was facing 4 wolves. Except they weren't. They looked like wolves at first. Large, slab-sided gray beasts in the dim light. But then he saw they were tied, their chains leading back to trees. They were watching him come, wagging their tails, and he knew they were dogs. 4 huge Malamutes. The one on the left whined softly and wiggled, trying to get him to come and pet. Brian stood there stunned. When beyond the dogs, he saw a crude log shelter covered with brush and a skin door. As he looked, a Native American man with a rifle stepped out of the door, saw Brian, and nodded. "It's you. I wondered when you'd come by." Brian stood, his mouth open. "We've got beaver cooking here, plenty for all of us." But how? Why? Who? "Smelled your smoke 3 weeks ago. I didn't want to bother you. There's some in the bush want to be alone. Figured you'd be here before this, but come on in." He turned and said something back into the shelter. 2 small children came out and stood next to the man, and a woman looked out over his shoulder. I don't know what to say." And Brian knew he meant it. He hadn't spoken to a person he had to stop and think. The days weren't there anymore. Always they had been there in the back of his mind every day. The count. Now they were gone. The man disappeared back inside the hut, and Brian still stood, the dogs whining softly, wiggling to be petted, and in a minute the man's head popped back out. "Are you coming inside?" Brian started, then stopped, and kicked out of his snowshoes, and walked inside the hut. So that's the end of 17, but I'm going to keep going with this epilogue. They were a Cree trapping family, and they had worked this area for 3 years. As soon as the ice was frozen on the lakes, they flew in a bush plane and set up camp, trapping beaver, fox, coyote, marten, fisher, and some lynx, living on moose meat. The popping sounds Brian had heard were the man named David Smallhorn shooting a moose for camp meat, and supplies brought in by air. The plane came back every 6 weeks, bringing more fuel and staples, flour, rice, potatoes, and school supplies for the homeschooling of the 2 children. Brian stayed with them for 3 weeks until the plane returned with the next load. The Smallhorn family were scrupulously polite, and because they had lived in the bush and didn't have television, they knew nothing of Brian's disaster. They thought he must be another trapper. It wasn't until after they'd eaten beaver meat broiled over the small metal stove in the log hut that David leaned over and asked, "How come is it you have skins for clothes and stone arrowheads? You look like one of the old way people." And Brian explained how he came to be in the woods, talking about each day as it had come, as he could remember it, until it was late and the children's heads were bobbing with sleep. And finally David held up his hand. "Tomorrow. More tomorrow. We'll take the dogs and toboggan and go back to your camp. Bring your things here, and then you can tell us more and show me how to shoot that thing." He pointed to the bow. "And how to make arrowheads," he smiled. "We don't use them anymore." And Brian slept in his clothes that night in the hut with the Smallhorns, and the next day watched while David harnessed the dogs and they set off on snowshoes. The dogs followed behind, pulling the toboggan. And in one trip, they brought back all that Brian owned, including the meat supply. Brian sat another evening and night telling them of all the things he had done and become. He showed them the bows and fish spears, killing lance, while they ate boiled potatoes and moose hump and had coffee thick with sugar. The next morning, Brian went with David on his trap line. They walked on snowshoes, while the dogs followed, pulling the toboggan, to load dead beaver from trap sets. And it came to be that within a week, Brian was almost part of the family. Within 2 weeks, he had to force himself to remember living alone and surviving. By the 3rd week, when he watched the bush plane circle and land on the lake ice on skis, the truth was he almost didn't want to leave. The woods had become so much a part of his life. The heat of it seemed to match his pulse, his breathing, that as he helped the Smallhorns and the pilot unload, he felt as if he were unloading gear and food for himself, as well as the family, as though he would be staying to watch the plane leave. But when it was done and everything unloaded, the pilot looked at him and nodded to the sky. There's weather coming in. I want to be gone before it hits. Brian stood by the plane, his hand on the wing strut, looking at the small horns who were standing by the pile of supplies. In the long hours of darkness, they had sipped tea and eaten greasy beaver meat and talked, and David knew Brian enough to know why he hesitated. He left the pile of supplies and came forward and smiled and waved an arm around at the country, all the woods and lakes and sky, and all that was in it. He knew he had touched Brian on the shoulder and said, "It will be here when you come back. We'll keep the soup hot." And Brian turned and stepped up into the plane. The end.